I couldn't believe how my life had turned into a nightmare in just 4 years. 4 years ago, my wife started working at Gilbert in Divorce. Our kids had become teenagers, and Sarah was eager to get out of the house. At the time, an entry-level secretarial job seemed perfect. My name is Skip Trexler. My real name is Austin, but everyone has always called me Skip. I've always been what people might call wiry. I'm of average height and weighed under 140 pounds. When I graduated high school that I wasn't interested in any kind of sports, especially competitive ones. The closest I came to anything athletic was long-range shooting. All through high school and college, I spent most of my non-academic time either shooting or reloading. After 8 years, I was able to consistently hit a 2-inch target from 100 yards away. My favorite weapon was the Marlin 336C, chambered for the 219 zipper cartridge. That round had been out of production for years, but I made my own by resizing 30 to 30 casings. Success in something like this gave me a sense of accomplishment that I desperately needed. During my college years, 2 important events occurred. I met my wife, Sarah, and my future business partner, Chuck Fuller. Aside from that, it was a bit uneventful. I earned a degree in geology, got married, and, together with Chuck, started a small surveying business. Life was good. Chuck and I never worked for anyone else. After college, we each invested $2,500 and founded our small surveying company. We focused on small jobs and numerous real estate transactions. We weren't making a lot of money, but we felt comfortable and were happy. Chuck married a local girl 3 months after Sarah and I tied the knot. My family owned a cabin that we called the Bungalow on 160 acres in Schuylkill County. It was where we held all our family gatherings when I was younger. The Fullers, on the other hand, had a proper hunting cabin on 640 acres in Potter County. Chuck and his family hunted there but didn't use it for much else. That's all you need to know for now. As I mentioned, my life started going downhill about 4 years ago. Gilbert Endeavors was a company that developed and manufactured exercise equipment. Its headquarters were local, but they had manufacturing plants and distribution centers across the country. My wife, Sarah, started working there when our twin daughters, Marcy and Mercy, began middle school. At first, it seemed like a great idea. The hours were good, the pay was fair, and the location was convenient. The first year or so was perfect. GE hired Terry Ulrich, a retired NFL defensive player, as their marketing manager and official company representative. Unfortunately, my wife worked in the marketing department. For 6 months, we were bombarded with stories about the great Terry Ulrich. My wife and daughters were absolutely enthralled by his charisma. Fortunately, after about 6 months, the infatuation seemed to fade. Around the same time Sarah started working overtime. Chuck and I both grew up in this area, so we knew many people who worked at Gilbert. It wasn't difficult to find out that Sarah and Terry Ulrich had become a couple. As their relationship blossomed, our marriage deteriorated. As Sarah and I drifted apart, my relationship with my daughters also began to fall apart. I never confronted her about it. She started traveling more frequently for business and promotional trips. I became invisible. Usually, but not always, she would invite me to accompany her to parties and events, where I was ignored until the end of the evening. As for intimacy, there was none. How does a person endure such a life? Until Sarah started working, our family life was normal. We would go on weekend getaways and vacations as a family at least once a year. The girls took ballet lessons and played soccer. Sarah was actively involved in the parent-teacher committee and scouts. Every week, we had a pizza night. The only thing the girls didn't like was spending time at the bungalow. All of that is in the past now. Everything is gone. Over the last few years, the number of Sarah's out-of-town conferences and meetings gradually increased. More recently, during some of her longer trips, she started taking the girls with her. I was never invited or even asked if I wanted to join. I often overheard the girls telling their friends about how much fun they had. They never said anything when they knew I was within earshot. Terry Ulrich was never mentioned, although I knew he was at every outing. At the New Year's party hosted by the Gilberts, everything finally became clear. Sarah could hardly avoid inviting me. I didn't want to go. The humiliation of silently living with her infidelity was bad enough. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to control myself if the situation escalated. I was right. The girls were dressed to the nines. Marcy and Mercy were thrilled because it was their first adult party. I didn't own a tuxedo, so I just wore the best suit I had. When we arrived, there were several hundred people gathered around. Skip Trexler. Glad you could make it. Thank you for bringing your lovely wife and daughters to our little gathering. Terry Ulrich seemed to smile even wider as he noticed the grimace on my face while he shook my hand. He finally let me go, and I caught Sarah smirking. The girls glanced at me with disgust before quickly walking away. That was the start of a terrible evening. I had a single beer and retreated to a corner, trying not to embarrass Sarah and the girls any further. I didn't say or do anything, and yet I still managed to ruin the start of their night. Terry Ulrich was a big guy, really big. He was at least a foot taller than me and weighed 100 pounds more, all muscle. He was the epitome of lucky hands and the spotlight. My daughters flitted around the room, but my wife spent almost the entire evening by his side. Most of the time, she lightly held on to his hand. A few people from the lower ranks made weak attempts to strike up a conversation with me. Several mid- and upper-level executives noticed me, smirked, or made sly comments to their companions, comments that, as I felt, were tied to my status as the cuckolded husband. I didn't hear the words, but the context was obvious. My beer had been replaced with plain ginger ale, which I sipped slowly. I normally prided myself on maintaining excellent self-control, and I rarely lost my composure. As many people started dancing, I noticed my daughters were having a good time, and so was my wife, naturally, with Ulrich. Over the last 3 hours, neither she nor the girls had spoken a single word to me. A small group of men and women were chatting off to the side of the dance floor when one of the guys pointed at Sarah and Ulrich. They glanced in my direction, started laughing, and quickly looked away when they saw me staring at them. A few minutes later, they were still giggling. That was the end of the evening for me. I set down my glass and, as I headed for the door, I caught sight of Ulrich's hands on my wife's backside while she caressed the back of his neck. Before I could even process what I was seeing, she pulled his head down and gave him a long, sloppy kiss right in the middle of the dance floor. It took me less than 5 seconds to cross the room, spin Ulrich around, and punch him as hard as I could with a right hook. My hand hurt like hell, and the next thing I remembered was waking up on the back seat of an ambulance. The hospital was only a few minutes away, and I noticed I was alone in the ambulance. I recalled being wheeled into the emergency department. The next thing I remembered was waking up in some kind of recovery area. About half an hour later, a doctor visited me and gave me an update on my condition. Along with a broken hand, I had 3 broken ribs, a broken nose, 3 knocked out teeth, and 2 loose ones. My jaw was wired shut, and my right kidney was bruised. Ulrich had finished me off with a solid hit to the groin, which had caused damage to a few blood vessels. The doctor said I could be discharged in about 4 days, but would need to spend at least 2 weeks in a rehabilitation center. If I preferred, they could arrange for home rehab. I chose the first option. It was well past noon when my wife and daughters finally showed up. Sarah looked irritated, and the girls seemed bored. No one said anything. Since my jaw was wired shut, I didn't feel like starting a conversation. I could speak, but I didn't want her to know that. Well, Skip. What do you have to say for yourself? I quickly gauged her attitude and decided this wasn't a conversation worth having. Instead of trying to respond, I just mumbled and pointed to my jaw that we must have sat there for a good minute before she spoke again. I was so embarrassed, Skip. The girls were humiliated that we had to leave before midnight. The entire evening was ruined, and for what? I should have known better than to bring you out in public. I guarantee this won't happen again. She had no idea how right she was. I just sat there, staring at her. I couldn't even muster a smile, so I didn't. They stayed for a few more minutes, but since I didn't respond, they eventually stood up and left. Chuck showed up a couple of hours later. We chatted for a few minutes. Yes, I could talk, and then he pulled out the local newspaper that I had made the front page. Local NFL hero defends wife and daughters from abusive father. The accompanying story detailed how I had allegedly attacked my wife while she was dancing at the annual Gilbert Endeavor's New Year's Eve party. Terry Ulrich supposedly burst into the room and held me down until I was taken away. Not exactly how I remembered it, but it was the story people would believe. Chuck and I talked for a couple of hours and went over a few options. After he left, I skipped dinner and asked for a sleeping pill. I needed a good, long rest. Most of the next day was spent being examined, poked, and prodded. All injuries were accounted for, and appropriate treatments were applied. Now, all I could do was wait and heal. A hospital staff member provided me with a list of recommended rehabilitation centers in the area. I chose one not far from Hamburg. Chuck came by later that evening. I sold him my share of the business for $2,500. Of course, the handshake during the deal was the most important part. I was still a co-owner, but not officially on paper. All good things come in time. We laughed about how 1 week in the rehab center cost exactly $2,500. Sarah and the girls never saw me again in the hospital. They did come back the day after I moved to the rehabilitation center, and from what I understand, they were very annoyed that they hadn't been informed. They were even angrier when they arrived at the rehab center and were denied access. Apparently, I had the ability to specify who could and couldn't visit me when I was admitted. One of the orderlies let me know they had tried to see me. My ribs hurt like hell when I laughed. The worst part of my injuries was dealing with my teeth. Thankfully, the center had a dentist who could work on site, for an additional fee. I decided to take advantage of that. The injury to my hand turned out to be less serious than initially thought. Although I had the option to leave rehab a little earlier, I chose to stay the full 2 weeks. After 10 days, I could finally breathe deeply again, and it felt good. Sarah never tried to visit me again. During the second weekend of February, the National CrossFit Exhibition took place in Atlantic City. Sarah and the girls attended with Terry Ulrich and the GE marketing team. Meanwhile, Chuck and a few of our employees spent the weekend moving my clothes and belongings to the bungalow in Schuylkill County. He made sure to bring my marlin and all my reloading supplies. 2 days later, I was comfortably settled in my new residence. That weekend, Chuck and his wife, June, came by to visit. Apparently, Sarah had been looking for me at the office. Since the start of the year, no deposits had been made into our joint account, and Sarah wanted an explanation. Chuck spent half an hour trying to explain to her that not only did I no longer own a share of the company, but I didn't even work there anymore. In frustration, she stormed out, threatening to meet with a lawyer. A couple of weeks later, I was functioning quite well. The jaw situation wasn't as bad as they initially thought, so I was back to eating and drinking normally within a few days. My dental issues had been resolved, and I decided to leave my broken nose as it was. I needed that little bit of character it added. The rest of the bruises and aches were healing nicely. I kept up with therapy and worked out as instructed. Chuck left me with one of the company trucks and a credit card. I also brought along a large sum of cash in case I needed it. I left my phone with Chuck. The bungalow was cozy, but only temporary. I did some walking and started jogging at a leisurely pace. Terry Ulrich had a large house on Duryea Drive, just outside of town. It was a long, winding road that climbed up Mount Penn. There weren't many houses there because building on the steep mountainside was difficult. Finding his house wasn't hard, and I managed to locate several good, secluded vantage points. Each morning, I worked out and got into shape. In the afternoons, I practiced target shooting. I focused on inanimate targets. My Bushnell laser rangefinder showed I needed to be accurate at 133 yards. I would be ready when I could consistently hit an egg from that distance. I bought a lot of eggs. I also bought a suppressor. I spent my evenings planning, adjusting, and reloading. I started growing a beard. Chuck visited me about once every 2 weeks. Sarah had dropped by the office a few times, still trying to find me. After 2 months, she gave up. Chuck always brought a few newspaper clippings with him. Apparently, my wife and daughters were continuing to enjoy a social life with their new benefactor. He must have been fully supporting her by now because I hadn't done anything. Oddly, Sarah and the girls were still living in our old house, which I didn't quite understand. It was time to move forward. I started going into town early in the morning to scout for a good vantage point to observe Terry's house. He was a creature of habit. I never expected someone his size to be a swimmer, but every morning he swam 50 laps. Naturally, the pool was heated. That weekend, I headed to Potter County. Moving from the bungalow to the cabin was a welcome change. No electricity, no plumbing, no cell signal. The nearest Walmart, in Olean, New York, was a 45-minute drive away. I didn't want to make that trip in winter, so I stocked up on everything I'd need for at least the next 4 months. If I forgot something or needed anything, I could get it before bad weather made the cabin inaccessible. Early Wednesday morning, I drove to the office and transferred all my belongings from the truck into my Subaru Outback. I parked the company truck at a construction site at the base of the mountain and climbed to the vantage point I had chosen. At that time of morning, there were no other cars around. I set up my tripod. I had 1 round chambered, 1 in the tube, and 2 more ready. 20 minutes later, Terry Ulrich came out for his morning swim. The first shot shattered his right ankle. Even with a suppressor, it was loud in the early morning stillness. 2 seconds later, his left knee exploded. I loaded the next 2 rounds and took out his left elbow. My final target was his right wrist, but I couldn't get a clear aim due to his erratic movements. So, I quickly packed up my weapon and quietly left. 10 minutes later, I left the construction site and returned to the office where my Subaru was waiting. I didn't return to the bungalow but drove straight to Potter County. My first priority was clearing the spring to ensure a fresh water supply. Then, I started gathering a good stockpile of firewood. Thankfully, the cabin was waterproof and well insulated. LED lights were much better and cheaper than the old kerosene lanterns that had been there before. Soon, everything was fully under control, and I resumed shooting practice, this time with paper targets. The first time I saw her was in the middle of the second week. A tall, lanky woman dressed in jeans, a flannel shirt, and a vest. Although she was far away, I could see she had a backpack or something similar strapped to her back. She walked along the old logging trail that ran parallel to the open clearing I used as a shooting range. 640 acres, and yet I still had no privacy. Of course, it would have been more practical to build the cabin closer to the road where supplies could be brought in. One day, when I had the opportunity, I aimed my scope at her. Hanging from her shoulder was a compact crossbow. I had no idea what she was doing with it, but I was curious. There was a small fire pit/barbecue area near the clearing, so I brought out an old galvanized coffee pot and some biscuits. Yes, I made some very good biscuits. It felt like I was setting some kind of trap. 3 days later, my trap worked. Excuse me. My name's Claire. I was hoping we could talk. She caught me off guard. I stammered a bit and motioned for her to sit. Would you like some coffee? It was the best I could manage. She nodded, smiled, and removed the crossbow from her shoulder before sitting down. My name's Skip. I got here about 2 weeks ago. I've noticed you around the area a few times. I'm staying at the caretaker's lodge about a mile from here. I try to walk every day and usually end up in this area. I handed her one of my famous biscuits. Will you be staying here long? I'll be here until the end of summer. And you? At least 4 or 5 months. She seemed to enjoy my biscuit, but I had the feeling she would have preferred cream and sugar in her coffee. She didn't say anything, but somehow, I picked up on it. Is this your property? No. It belongs to a friend who lets me use it. Do you hunt? No. Not really. I used to do a bit of shooting, but I haven't done anything like that in years. Now, I just do some target practice. I don't want to be a bother, but would you mind if I used this range for a bit of practice? I haven't found a suitable spot to use my bow. She had an accent I couldn't place. English? Australian? Scottish? I didn't want to ask, not at all. I think we could find something suitable for target support. Feel free to use it anytime. She ate a second biscuit. I was feeling quite pleased, I'm just curious. I thought most people use compound bows these days. Yours is a recurve bow, and it looks new. Trust me, it's better for recurve shooting. For target practice, she used simple arrows, but she always carried 4 hunting arrows secured to her bow. That evening, I drove a few miles down the road and picked up 3 bales of hay. And so began my summer with Claire Charles. Claire came by every day and returned to her lodge each evening. The lodge staff had a tracker on her cell phone, so they always knew where she was. At the start of our second week, a heavy summer storm rolled in. We huddled on the cabin's porch, laughing and joking about her predicament. Without saying a word, she took out her phone and called the lodge. She informed them that, due to the weather, she wouldn't be able to make it back that evening and had found a comfortable place to stay. I was both surprised and delighted. That's how my platonic relationship with Claire Charles turned into something intimate. From that point on, we alternated our sleeping arrangements. Highlands Lodge was entirely out of place in Potter County, luxurious and very expensive. Most of their guests were from overseas. Claire's family was from Cornwall. The lodge offered hot showers, abundant food, and laundry services, all of which I took full advantage of. Outdoor intimacy is fun, but it's far more enjoyable when you have all the amenities. We spent less and less time at the shooting range. A couple of weeks later, while Claire and I were having lunch, Chuck and June showed up. June seemed particularly thrilled that I had a companion, even more so when she realized it was a fully fledged relationship. For the first few hours, we kept things casual, but eventually, June and Claire went off to chat. After the tragic attack on Terry Ulrich, I became the prime suspect. This turned out to be a much bigger problem for Terry than he had anticipated. The press wanted to know why I was the main person of interest. The more they dug into it, the worse things got for Terry and my wife. While the primary focus remained on finding me, the media quickly shifted its attention to the relationship between Terry and my wife. 3 weeks later, Terry Ulrich was no longer the spokesperson for Gilbert Endeavors. The police visited the bungalow in Schuylkill County and found it empty. They had no leads on credit card transactions, no phone records, and no ideas about where I might be. They never thought to ask Chuck about the cabin. Chuck mentioned that Sarah had stopped by the office several times, unsuccessfully trying to figure out my whereabouts. She seemed somewhat desperate, as her financial support had begun to dry up. According to Chuck, it turned out that Terry had lost interest in her and blamed her for his troubles. I didn't have a plan for what to do next. I couldn't go back, and I didn't have any other options I wanted to explore. At the moment, I was drifting. As the year drew to a close, I felt myself becoming complacent. I was happy and content with Claire, but I knew I needed to start focusing on my real life. It was a cool autumn day, and I was alone in the cabin. Something felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I had just stoked the wood stove and brewed some coffee when the door suddenly flew open. Terry Ulrich was just as big and ugly as the last time I'd seen him. He stood in the doorway, a wide grin on his face, holding an old police-issue revolver in his right hand. He looked unsteady and held his left arm at an awkward angle, as though trying to maintain his balance. We simply stood there, staring at each other. I expected some profound words of vengeance, but none came. Coffee. You bastard. I've spent over $10,000 trying to find you. No, I don't want any damn coffee. Well, what can I do for you? I know it was you, you sneaky little prick. Your wife told me you spent plenty of time shooting targets. I hope there's a 911 service here, because you're gonna need it. His face grew red and swollen as he spoke, and he seemed to be working himself into some sort of frenzy. Suddenly, a look of shock crossed his face, he dropped the gun, and collapsed onto one knee. Terry Ulrich rolled over onto the floor and let out a blood-curdling scream. About 12 inches of a crossbow bolt stuck out from his left buttock. The remaining 6 inches were buried deep and securely. Claire stood in the doorway, simply smiling. We ran almost the entire way back to Highlands Lodge. I didn't take anything with me from the cabin. It took Claire about 15 minutes to load all her things into the rental Land Rover. We laughed the entire time, like a couple of high school kids. We finally calmed down to a somewhat normal state by the time we reached US 80. Breakfast was comforting and satisfying. I assume he's already pulled out the bolt and made it to the hospital, she said. I don't think so. He'll have to call 911. I shot him with one of my hunting bolts, fitted with a 3-blade broadhead. It has to be cut out. It can't just be pulled. He'll probably have to lie on his stomach on a stretcher when they take him to the emergency room. That should be awkward. Well, Miss Claire, it seems we're in a lot of trouble now, and it's all your fault. She clicked her fork, loaded with scrambled eggs, and laughed. After breakfast, I called Chuck, and Claire called someone else. I filled Chuck in on the situation, and he seemed to find it pretty amusing. I told him we were heading to Ocala, Florida, where my grandparents used to live. He chuckled a bit, knowing I said it just to give him plausible deniability. While I was on the phone, Claire walked over and pulled my wallet from my pocket. She went back to her seat and continued her call while I picked out some treats for our trip that I had no idea where we were going, but I had the feeling Claire had a plan. She didn't share it with me, and I didn't ask. I was content with my ignorance and trusted her. It was a long day. We finally stopped at a lovely bed and breakfast in the Wisconsin Dells. We were exhausted from the road and fell right to sleep. Breakfast was fantastic, and 4 hours later, we were at a Walmart in Duluth. Claire had her things, but I had left with nothing. I had no idea what she was planning, and she seemed to enjoy keeping me in the dark. I ended up with a new wardrobe, and Claire walked out with a big bag of snacks. Since I was a boy, I'd dreamed of taking a canoe trip across the lakes. At last, I was able to make it happen. Everything was arranged by the time we arrived. The outfitter even offered to take care of Claire's rental car, which gave me a hint that we probably wouldn't be coming back. It was both intriguing and exciting. I couldn't wait to see what else she had planned for me. Before leaving, I made one last call to Chuck. Skip. What the hell did you do? The news is full of Ulrich's latest debacle. Even some of the national outlets picked it up. Damn it, Chuck, I have no idea what you're talking about. I could hear June laughing in the background. Well, his public image is crashing like a lead balloon. Seems like he can't do anything right. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, I said, finally getting to use the line I'd always wanted. By the way, Skip, the divorce move. Brilliant. Sarah didn't see it coming, and it hit her hard. Not sure how you managed it, but it seems to have worked. She has no idea what to do and no money. Chuck. Trust me, I'm not joking. I have no clue what you're talking about. I haven't even spoken to a lawyer. Are you sure about the divorce? Yep. She was waving the papers in my face and ranting about it just this morning. Well, it's nice to get some good news for a change. By the way, could you stop by the cabin and arrange for someone to pick up my things and car? No problem. Where are you now? Moss Bluff, Florida. I'm looking for a trailer to rent. Claire was standing on the dock, waving at me. The canoe was loaded to the brim. I silently thanked my parents for making me go to Boy Scout camp when I was younger. At least I didn't feel like a complete idiot in a canoe. For the next 6 days, we paddled through the lakes. Every night, we set up a new campsite. Claire knew exactly where she was going and used her phone's GPS to guide us. I simply followed along and enjoyed the journey. The best part of the trip was making love under the stars. By midday the next day, our adventure continued. At a small dock on a remote road, we were met by a man. He and Claire embraced and started speaking in French. About half an hour later, he handed Claire a set of truck keys along with a large envelope. We unloaded our things from the canoe and drove off. Looking back through the rear window, I saw him pushing off from the dock. I was in the driver's seat and Claire began rummaging through the envelope. I think I'd better get used to calling you Clinton. Naturally, I gave her a confused look. She giggled and handed me a Canadian driver's license with my photo on it. The name on the license read, Clinton Barfield. You're kidding, right? Nope. You're Clinton Barfield now, and you've got a shiny new Canadian passport. She waved it proudly in front of my face. Are we in Canada? Of course, silly. 4 days later, we landed in Yuki. 2 hours after that, we arrived at Claire's family home near Street Austell. It felt like I had been born there. I was comfortable and content. I was quite nervous about meeting Claire's family. The mansion was enormous. Her father invited me to join him in his study. Along the far wall stood an elegant walnut gun cabinet. I watched with interest as he reached inside and pulled out a rifle. He handed it to me with a smile. It was my Marlin 336C, complete with its chamber. That's when I knew I was home. Epilogue. I never saw or heard anything about Sarah or the girls again. Chuck and June continued to receive strange Christmas cards every year from Mr. and Mrs. Clinton Barfield. They had no idea. This year's card will feature a photo of us with our 3 children. I'm sure Chuck will figure it out. Was there ever really a Terry Ulrich?